The first thing you notice out here isn't the silence, but the sheer, crushing pressure of the deep woods, a damp, decaying smell that gets into your clothes and never leaves, mixed with something sharp, like old iron and regret. Sometimes, if you listen hard enough, the wind through the tall pines sounds less like rustling leaves and more like whispered, endless apologies. And if you hear a knock, don't answer it. I started my career in the Obsidian Preserve, a sprawling scar of mountains and dense timber straddling 3 state lines, officially known for its breathtaking isolation, unofficially known for being the place where people went to be forgotten. Tonight, I'm going to tell you how the forest taught me that the things you can shoot are rarely the things you should fear the most. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're watching, drop your location and the local time in the comments. Headphones on, world off. The nightmare is waiting. If you're still awake at this hour, you already know why. A subtle, high-pitched whine is cutting through the local frequency tonight. It's not radio static. It sounds like the electrical humming of something enormous and exhausted, just beyond the reach of hearing. When I first transferred to the Obsidian Preserve, I was full of that young, dumb optimism you only get before the world shows you its teeth. I thought I was exchanging the chaos of the city for the solemn peace of nature. I had chosen the most remote assignment the service offered, Ranger Post 14, a small, insulated cabin near the boundary with the Three Sisters Wilderness. The official briefing was all about trail maintenance and fire prevention. The unofficial briefing, which came from the weary eyes of the retiring veteran, was simply, keep your nose clean, and if you see anything that doesn't belong, pretend you didn't. This isn't your woods yet, kid. I quickly learned the truth about isolation. It's not a lack of people. It's the certainty that the few people who are out here chose this location for a reason, and it's rarely a good one. The first hint that the preserve was a labyrinth designed by others came subtly, almost playfully, through the infrastructure. My job was routine patrols, usually in the massive, decommissioned surplus truck we called the Beast. But I kept noticing anomalies. Tripwires, almost invisible, crisscrossing unofficial game trails. Not hunting traps, but thin, taut nylon lines set chest high. I'd find one, dismantle it, and a week later, I'd find 3 more, smarter, tied to rusty bells or empty aluminum cans, forming rudimentary alarm systems. It started feeling like I was walking through someone else's living room. One cold, wet October morning, while tracking a lost hiker near the old copper mine sector, a place the maps designated restricted wilderness, I found the most sophisticated setup yet. It was a pressure plate, beautifully camouflaged beneath thick moss, connected to a camera that used infrared flash, mounted 30 feet up in a massive Douglas fir. It wasn't pointed at the trail. It was pointed at the ranger patrol path, specifically timed to catch the Beast passing by. Fear isn't about what we see. It's about what we imagine is watching us. And someone, or several people, were watching my schedule, my movements, and my habits with military precision. I started varying my patrols wildly, driving north when I was scheduled south, switching to foot patrol at random intervals. The invisible eyes followed. One evening, back at Post 14, I received a cryptic, distorted radio signal on a secure frequency, a sequence of clicks and pauses that lasted maybe 5 seconds. When I ran the audio through the system later, my heart clenched. It was a highly specialized, archaic military burst transmission, a way to send a short, coded message without being traced. The contents, when decrypted, were chillingly personal. Unit 14, change of shift 3 o'clock. Watch the West Ridge. I am just one man, a ranger tasked with counting migrating elk and checking campfire permits, suddenly feeling like I'd stumbled onto an enormous chessboard where I was the pawn, and my movements were being dictated by someone utterly cynical. There is a grounding fact about the topography of the Obsidian Preserve. The sheer density of the interior forests creates localized, perpetual dead zones. These zones are areas where cell reception, GPS, and even satellite communication die completely, often for miles at a time. This isn't a natural phenomenon. Geologists theorize it's due to a complex intersection of heavy magnetite deposits and subterranean mineral water. Criminals, however, see it as freedom. It's the perfect place for a speculative concept, the creation of an untraceable, completely autonomous society existing within the preserve's legal boundaries, operating on a closed system of logistics and communication that bypasses the modern world entirely. A dark, self-sustaining glitch in the reality of the forest. I spent a few weeks dismissing the tripwires as a single paranoid squatter, maybe an anti-government recluse. The radio message? Maybe a cross signal from a nearby military exercise. I needed to believe that, because the alternative meant the woods themselves were designed to trap me. My routine duties pushed me deeper into the less patrolled sectors. The preserve is bisected by the notorious Interstate 80 corridor, a ribbon of civilization that acts like a blood vessel, pumping life, and everything else, through the quiet heart of the nation. It was on the western edge of the I-80 sector, known for its steep, brush-choked ravines and unstable shale, that I found the first physical evidence of what was truly going on. It was mid-November, the air sharp and the ground slick with frozen dew. I was checking a remote wildlife camera when I saw the disturbance. Not boot prints, but a heavy, deliberate sliding trail cutting through the thick undergrowth, leading straight down into a narrow, muddy defile below a massive, granite overhang. The kind of path made by dragging something heavy and inert. I followed the drag marks, my service pistol already out, the safety off. The silence down there was complete, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and something vaguely metallic. At the bottom, partially concealed by a heap of rotting pine needles and a large, oddly placed tarp, was the source of the metallic scent. It was a foot, small and pale, clad in a sock, protruding from beneath the earth. A human foot. The sight didn't immediately trigger panic. It triggered a strange, cold clarity. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a lost hiker. This was disposal. I remember thinking, with a dreadful certainty, whoever buried this person knew precisely how many days it would take for the local fauna to uncover it, and they had calculated that risk perfectly. They wanted this spot to hold its secret, and now I was standing over it, interrupting their dark calculus. I checked the lock on your window, just in case. The bureaucratic nightmare that followed the discovery of the first body, a young woman, identity quickly confirmed as missing from a city 3 states away, was monumental. But the psychological shift was the worst. The woods, which had felt like a silent, indifferent home, suddenly felt like the walls of a mausoleum built specifically for the lost. After the initial forensics team swept the area, led by a surprisingly arrogant county sheriff named Deputy Thane, they left, declaring it an isolated incident, a traveler who met with foul play far from home. But I couldn't shake the feeling of calculated placement. The sheer effort of dragging a body through that ravine, avoiding the few official trails, implied familiarity and purpose. I started my own, unofficial investigation, using my patrol routes as cover. I didn't trust Deputy Thane's easy dismissal, especially when I noticed his vehicle, a pristine white Tahoe, parked deep in a restricted fire access road late one night, far from any patrol zone. I returned to the ravine under the cover of a dense fog bank, the kind of meteorological event that shuts down the I-80 corridor completely, wrapping the preserve in an impenetrable, suffocating shroud. I went lower, deeper, into the unstable shale ledges. I wasn't looking for evidence of the crime. I was looking for patterns of usage, and I found them. About 60 yards down the slope, concealed expertly beneath a thick mantle of overgrown kudzu vine and loose scree, was a large, flat slab of slate, too large to be natural in that context. I spent nearly an hour prying it loose with a borrowed forestry jack. What I uncovered was not a grave, but an access point. The air that rushed out was cold, stagnant, and carried a pungent mixture of decay and mineral dust. Beneath the slab, carefully packed into 3 separate, shallow compartments, were 3 more people. Not recent, like the first victim. These were older, preserved by the cold, damp earth and the lack of oxygen. A woman and 2 men, all stripped of clothing, all positioned facing upward toward the slate cover, as if awaiting a specific sign. It was impossible to see this as anything other than a dedicated, systematic storage unit. I called it in immediately, bypassing Thane and going straight to the state police non-emergency line, dropping the bombshell that I had found what looked like a subterranean inventory. When the state and eventually the federal authorities descended, the scope of the horror became terrifyingly clear. Forensic analysis quickly linked the 4 bodies, and later, the fragments of 2 more discovered nearby, to a large-scale, interstate human trafficking operation that had been feeding victims into the I-80 corridor for nearly 15 years. The Obsidian Preserve wasn't just dangerous because of wildlife. It was dangerous because it was the perfect, anonymous corporate dumping site. The logistical complexity of running a crime ring that spans multiple states and includes clandestine disposal sites requires serious infrastructure. It requires insiders. One grounding fact of organized crime is the principle of local penetration. Any successful long-term operation requires reliable, trusted, local knowledge, people who know the blind spots, the patrol schedules, and the specific terrain that will never be explored by outsiders. As the investigation widened, the arrests started pouring in, primarily from outside the preserve. Truckers, motel owners, financiers. But the net inevitably tightened around the local area. The biggest fish were found to be 2 brothers, Lyle and Remy Thorne, officially employed by the Obsidian Preserve Maintenance Division. They had worked here since the late 90s, knew every deer path, every seasonal erosion pattern, and, crucially, knew exactly when Ranger Unit 14, my predecessor, was checking the northern perimeter versus the southern. They had provided the perfect, silent cover for years, camouflaging the dumping site, monitoring traffic, and communicating with the network using their park radio systems. But the final revelation was the coldest. Deputy Thane, the arrogant local sheriff who had swept the first body and quickly declared it an isolated incident, was the highest-ranking local informant, managing the network's logistics and protecting the Thorne brothers from any internal inquiry. He knew the precise frequency of my patrols. He knew when I was gone and when I was alone. I was no longer just a ranger. I was the unintended witness, the monkey wrench thrown into a sophisticated 15-year machine. The retaliation was swift, silent, and designed to terrify. I was placed in a safe house near the park boundary, technically a witness, but still wearing the uniform. One morning, my patrol truck, which had been parked securely in the maintenance yard, now under federal lock and key, was found vandalized. The tires were slashed, and the windshield had been meticulously cleaned and then smeared with something dark and viscous. It looked like blood, though forensics later called it animal hemoglobin, professionally sourced. What chilled me was the note. It was a single, laminated strip of paper tucked neatly under the wiper blade, perfectly protected from the drizzle. The text was printed in crisp, white font on a black background. Rangers who get lost stay lost. You chose the wrong woods, Unit 14. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of policy. They weren't panicking, they were adjusting the schedule. The speculative concept haunting me now was the idea of the ghost map. The Thorne brothers, Thane, and the network had operated on a map of the preserve that existed only in their minds. A topography of criminal opportunity overlaid onto the official park boundaries. They weren't using the trails, they were the trails. They were the unseen architects of the park's secret, sinister function. And I had memorized their blueprint. The terror wasn't just physical. It was the realization that the wilderness itself was a conspirator, offering perfect isolation for perfect depravity. I became obsessed with my own security. Every shadow held a watcher. Every rustle of leaves was a movement toward me. I started sleeping in my truck, sometimes 30 miles from the nearest road, preferring the unpredictable discomfort to the certainty of being found at Post 14. They sent me pictures. Not pictures of me, but highly zoomed, slightly out of focus telephoto shots of my truck, my post, and my personal items, always taken from impossible distances deep within the woods. One picture showed a single, small silver fish pendant, a gift from my mother, which I had left on my desk inside the locked cabin, centered perfectly on the frame. It was a clear message: lock your doors, but we're already inside your head. The FBI offered two options: witness protection or immediate transfer. I chose the latter, fleeing the Obsidian Preserve for a tiny, snow-dusted state park in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, trading the dense, menacing pines for flat, open snow fields. I thought the openness would help. It didn't. The preserve had taught me that the forest never lets go. Every time I smell pine sap, I wonder if the next thing I'll find is a note, tucked under my wiper blade, reminding me that Unit 14 still has an appointment with the void. The transfer was supposed to be a reset, a clean slate. But the Obsidian Preserve leaves a residue, a specific kind of psychological rot that makes you incapable of trusting silence. I was moved to the Huron Lakes Recreation Area, a place where the biggest crime was usually an expired fishing license. I was still officially a park ranger, but now I handled the paperwork for campgrounds and the occasional lost golden retriever. The uniform felt like a disguise. My old life, however, was about to be revisited, not by the I-80 network, but by the relentless danger endemic to isolation. My new partner was a veteran ranger named Alara. She was tough, methodical, and had seen her share of trouble, though nothing like the systemic horror I had just fled. Alara was assigned to the most remote outpost in the Huron area, the Heron Watch Station, a tiny cabin perched atop a rocky bluff, primarily used for wildfire monitoring and located 8 hours of rough driving from the main office. Because of the lessons learned from the Obsidian Preserve, Alara had lobbied hard for a dedicated communications repeater, ensuring the station wasn't entirely cut off, a thin thread of security. One unusually quiet Tuesday night, I was pulling the late shift in dispatch, monitoring the meager traffic. The air crackled with the usual atmospheric noise, punctuated by the rhythmic, slightly fuzzy beacon from the Heron Watch repeater. Then, the beacon stopped. A few minutes later, Alara's voice came through, but it was ragged, compressed with static, and pitched low with panic. "Control, This is Heron Watch. I have an unauthorized broadcast on Channel 6. Repeat, I have a male voice attempting contact. I keyed the mic. Heron Watch, Control. Switched to encrypted Channel 3. Identify caller. Alara didn't switch. Her voice came back, thin and desperate. He's not calling in. He's calling me. He knows my name, Unit 22. He knows my sister's name. He said, Claire, you shouldn't have dyed your hair last month. The dark suits you better. A bolt of pure dread shot through me. This wasn't a lost hiker. This was the language of surveillance, the currency of the stalker. It was the same invasive intimacy I had experienced with the surveillance photos back at Obsidian. The speculative concept here, the one that makes your skin crawl, is the personal predator, the type of hunter who requires deep knowledge, not just of the terrain, but of the victim's specific, private life, making the isolation an inescapable stage for their performance. Alara confirmed the chilling details. The caller knew she hated the instant coffee stored in the cabin. He knew the exact time she spoke to her parents on Sunday, and he knew the registration number of her official patrol vehicle parked 100 yards down the track. Then, the lights at the Heron Watch flickered once, died, and the repeater's signal vanished entirely. My training kicked in, the kind of frantic, high-stakes adrenaline response you only get when you know the victim is isolated and the predator is already closing the door. I scrambled the nearest available assets, a state police helicopter that was conducting unrelated maneuvers 90 miles away. The flight time was 45 minutes, minimum. Alara was alone. I spent the next 40 minutes on the emergency frequency, yelling into the void, trying to raise her, my voice cracking against the dead air. Then, a terrible, triumphant voice cut through the silence on the main channel, distorted but chillingly clear. She's quiet now, Ranger. You didn't tell her about the fire safety rules, did you? Gasoline is wonderful on old aluminum, isn't it? The helicopter pilot reported seeing a massive column of black smoke rising from the vicinity of the Heron Watch. I knew, with absolute certainty, that this man was Walter Hutchinson, a name whispered in hushed tones around the Great Lakes Ranger stations. Hutchinson was a former forest firefighter, highly intelligent, highly disturbed, who specialized in hunting female rangers assigned alone to remote lookout stations. For him, the isolation was the essential ingredient, the proof of his power. He was the only man in 100 square miles, and he was there to impose his will. This was his signature. The situation demanded immediate, agonizing reflection. I thought, fear isn't about what we see. It's about what we imagine is watching us. But in this case, Alara wasn't imagining it. She was being stalked by a man who treated these remote stations like a collection of isolated targets, a system failure waiting to be exploited. Alara, whose real name was Claire, was fighting for her life. The man had cut the power, poured gasoline on her patrol truck, and was now actively trying to flush her out of the cabin, or burn her alive inside. The grounding fact here is related to remote wilderness architecture. These stations, built in the 1960s, invariably include a secondary, subterranean root cellar or communication bunker, usually located 50 feet from the main structure and accessed by a thick, steel hatch. It's an institutional standard, though rarely used. As I listened to the garbled transmissions from the advancing helicopter crew, I desperately keyed the mic, knowing the broadcast might be intercepted, but praying Claire was listening somewhere. Unit 22, the cellar. Go to the cellar. Secure the hatch. Whether she heard me, or if her own training took over, I'll never know. But the helicopter reported that Hutchinson, a lean, desperate figure, was actively pouring fuel around the perimeter of the cabin when he suddenly stopped, turned, and started running into the heavy timber just as the helicopter spotlight illuminated the scene. He was fleeing, not because of the helicopter, but because his victim had vanished. Claire was found hours later, unharmed but traumatized, secured inside the concrete radio bunker, the heavy hatch bolted shut from the inside. Hutchinson was tracked and arrested 2 days later, hiding in a shallow cave near a logging road, clinging to a laminated folder filled with photos of other remote female rangers. It was revealed that he had killed at least 3 others over the past decade, always targeting the most isolated posts, always burning the car first. The consequence of this horror was definitive. The Huron Lake Service immediately instituted a new rule. No remote station may be staffed by fewer than 2 people, ever. The lesson was learned again, painfully. I had fled the systemic, organized malice of the Obsidian Preserve only to run headlong into the solo, focused malice of a specialist hunter. The forest attracts them all, the organized crime and the lone psychopaths, because the silence gives them permission. And I was trapped in this cycle of fear, forever moving from one darkness to another. After the Hutchinson nightmare, I was relocated again. The service, trying to compensate for the trauma, gave me an assignment in the fictional comfort of the Greenbelt State Forest, a small, heavily regulated park that felt more like a manicured garden than true wilderness. I became the ranger who dealt with picnic area reservations and the occasional lost dog. It was soul-numbing, but safe. Or so I thought. One chilly afternoon in early spring, I was conducting a routine maintenance check of the boundaries, a fence line that separated the state forest from a vast, privately owned timber reserve. I was walking the line, checking for fallen trees, when I felt a peculiar tug on my boot. It wasn't a root. It was a wire, almost invisible against the damp mulch, stretched taut and low across the path. This time, there was no rustic bell or aluminum can. This tripwire was meticulously clean, professionally placed, and connected to something complex hidden behind a curtain of dense ferns. I approached cautiously. What I found was a sophisticated, small-caliber crossbow mechanism, mounted low to the ground, aimed directly at chest height for anyone walking the official trail. It was a deadly trap, designed not to capture an animal, but to neutralize a human being silently and permanently. The cold certainty returned. I was back in someone's labyrinth. I immediately called the state police, citing my experience at Obsidian Preserve and insisting this was not the work of a hobbyist hunter. When the bomb squad and specialized tactical units arrived, they treated the area like a military zone. I watched as they systematically swept the perimeter, and the discoveries began to multiply, chillingly fast. The tripwire I had found was just the first strand in a vast, complex web. Within 50 acres, they found 67 unique, interconnected traps. Pit traps, deep enough to break a leg, covered with perfectly matched foliage. Bear traps bolted to tree roots, designed to sever a limb. And more crossbow mechanisms, positioned at varying heights, all zeroed in on the established patrol paths and unofficial logging trails. The forest had been turned into a battlefield. The authorities identified the perpetrator almost immediately, Mason Keller. Keller was a former Army combat engineer, a man trained in ordnance and stealth, who had become a federal fugitive after losing a high-profile custody battle. His life had been derailed by what he perceived as a hostile system, and now he had declared war on that system by turning a national forest into his own personalized, untraceable sanctuary of vengeance. Keller wasn't looking for money or specific victims. He was establishing sovereignty. The speculative concept I wrestled with here was the idea of the sovereign glitch, the complete mental collapse where an individual rejects all societal norms and uses the boundless isolation of the wilderness to create a private country governed by hatred and lethal traps. The chase lasted 3 long, terrifying weeks. The park was closed, locked down, turning my tranquil greenbelt into a staging ground for heavily armed police. They couldn't use helicopters effectively because the density of the canopy and the complexity of the traps made ground insertion too risky. Keller knew the forest better than the police, and he used his traps to herd and harass them, forcing them into specific, pre-mapped kill zones. I assisted the tactical teams, sharing my acquired knowledge of identifying subtle, man-made disturbances in the natural camouflage. I learned a grounding fact about paranoia. Keller wasn't just setting traps, he was setting signals. He would leave a single, perfectly placed military boot print near a deactivated trap, just to let us know he was watching the clearance team. My reflective thought during those grueling weeks was that the greatest danger in the deep woods is always the deliberate, calculated intent of a focused human mind. Keller's intent was total annihilation of anyone who invaded his new domain. The search eventually tracked Keller to an elaborate, subterranean bunker near an abandoned fire lookout tower. He wasn't living like a wild man. He was living like a siege engineer, complete with sophisticated communication gear, surveillance monitors, and caches of military-grade rations. The arrest was violent, but successful. Keller was taken alive, receiving a 25-year sentence for attempted murder and weaponizing federal land. The Greenbelt State Forest had to remain closed for 3 additional weeks for full remediation. We cleared 67 traps, but every single ranger, every officer, and especially me, the man who tripped the first wire, left with the distinct, unsettling knowledge that we had not found them all. The incident was supposed to be the end of it, a clear-cut case of human madness contained. But the pattern of my life was established. I was a magnet for the worst secrets of the woods. My next assignment, inevitably, pulled me back toward the original kind of horror, the unseen, the patiently waiting. I was transferred to the Blackwater National Forest, a place known for its vast, empty tracts and its permanent lack of cell signal. It was here that I encountered the silent hunter, the one who didn't use traps or large criminal networks, but only time and invisibility. I had 7 years of ranger experience now, 7 years of seeing the very worst humanity had to offer in the most beautiful settings. I was conducting a routine survey of an unofficial, hiker-created path, known locally as the Lonesome Trail, a place where hikers often disappeared without a trace. The official reports always cited misadventure or animals, but the locals used a different word: evaporated. What struck me first was the state of the abandoned campsites. Not ransacked or hurried, but abandoned intact. Tents pitched perfectly, sleeping bags rolled out, fresh food left on cooling camp stoves, almost as if the inhabitants had simply walked away mid-sentence. It was too neat. Following a hunch born of years of paranoia, I started looking up, not down. And there, deep in the thickest sections of ancient pines, I found them. A series of makeshift observation huts, concealed high up in the canopy, accessed by thin, near-invisible rope ladders. They were built with extreme patience, using only natural materials, blending seamlessly with the tree line. These weren't deer blinds. They were human surveillance posts. Inside the third hut, I found the evidence: a small, weathered notebook. It wasn't a diary. It was an inventory. Precise dates, descriptions of individuals, gender, hair color, equipment, and strange, chilling codes I couldn't decipher, followed by the word harvested. This was the lair of a true hunter, a patient predator who had been monitoring these unofficial trails for years, studying behavior, identifying targets, waiting weeks for the perfect window to simply make someone vanish. He was the ultimate speculative concept, the apex tracker, someone who had rejected all human society to become pure, methodical predator, living invisibly within the ecosystem, using the forest's silence as his ultimate weapon. The hunter of the lonesome trail was the most terrifying of all the criminals I had encountered because he operated with zero ambition other than the hunt itself. He wasn't after money or territory. He was after the perfect, untraceable kill. His notebook, that chilling inventory of the lost, was immediately handed over to the FBI, leading to the grim confirmation that several long-term missing persons cases were solved, though not resolved, by the simple, calculated entries. July 19th, subject F/solo red tent. Harvested. I spent the next 3 days guiding specialized search teams through the dense underbrush of the Blackwater National Forest, using the hunter's own hidden pathways, the network of canopy huts and faint, pressure-sensitive trails he had created. I felt his presence everywhere, a cold, empty spot in the heat of the humid air. He was watching us search his hunting ground. The climax of that dreadful search came when we stumbled upon the processing station. It was a small, crudely built lean-to, camouflaged by a natural rock overhang and piled brush, positioned miles from any road. The smell hit us first, not decay, but the metallic, chemical sharpness of commercial bleach mixed with stale ice. Inside, the light was dim and green, filtered through the thick surrounding canopy. There was a rusted chest freezer, bolted shut, and a folding table covered in surgical steel instruments. But what truly broke my composure was the wall display. Neatly pinned up, arranged by date, were photographs. Not graphic photos, but candid snapshots of the victims before they vanished. A woman laughing as she set up her tent, a couple eating dinner by a campfire, a lone hiker admiring a distant peak. These were his trophies, cataloging the moment of their freedom before he intervened. The hunter, despite the massive police presence, was gone. He had vanished into the terrain he had so perfectly mastered. We recovered evidence, confirmed the full scope of his depravity, and closed the lonesome trail permanently, erasing it from all public maps. I was transferred immediately after, still haunted by the face of the laughing woman in the photo, a life snuffed out by an invisible predator who still lurked somewhere in the Blackwater silence. My trajectory had become a downward spiral, a constant descent into the most well-hidden abuses of the natural world. I accepted a new assignment, ostensibly managing environmental surveys in the Whispering Pines National Forest, a place known, ironically, for its calm, predictable topography. My new supervisor was a man named Ben Hawkins. Ben was the quintessential old-school ranger, gray-haired, quiet, with a kind, avuncular demeanor and an encyclopedic knowledge of local history. He seemed like the grounding fact I desperately needed, a steady presence in a profession that had become synonymized with dread. I felt, for the first time in years, a sliver of peace. That peace lasted 6 months. I was living in the main ranger barracks, and Ben lived in the isolated, 2-story supervisor's station, situated in a remote clearing known as the Elder Circle, so named for the gigantic, ancient redwood stumps that dominated the area. My wife, Amy, who had moved with me, became friends with Ben's wife, Sarah. One evening, Sarah confessed to Amy that Ben had a very specific, unbreakable routine. Every Thursday night, rain or shine, he drove his official truck, alone, to the Elder Circle clearing. He would park, walk into the trees for about 30 minutes, and return with a massive sense of relief. He never explained where he went. It seemed like harmless eccentricity, until Amy noted that every one of Ben's field trips coincided perfectly with a recent missing hiker report in the area. Reports Ben himself often minimized and filed away as misadventure. I remembered the lesson from Obsidian. The worst criminals are often insiders. We started a low-key, terrifying investigation. The Elder Circle clearing had always felt strange to me. Too quiet, too unnaturally soft underfoot. Using the cover of a late-night wildlife camera installation, I took my shovel to the periphery of the giant stumps. The soil was disturbingly loose, despite the lack of recent excavation. The speculative concept that seized me was the ritual of the familiar. The idea that a serial killer operating for decades finds not just a dumping ground, but a sacred, repeatable location, a place of power where the act of disposal becomes a ritual of affirmation, hidden in plain sight. The first shovel cut through something soft, not root, not earth. It was human skin. What I unearthed there remains the single, most horrifying image of my career. Shallow graves, dug just deep enough to conceal the bodies from surface inspection, radiating outward from the central supervisor station. The bodies, all hikers, all stripped naked, were arranged in a perfect, wide circle, facing inward toward the station itself, like silent, eternal sentinels surrounding Ben's home. This hadn't happened recently. The depth of the decay suggested victims spanning 15 to 20 years, perhaps since 1997. Ben Hawkins, my gentle, avuncular supervisor, had been murdering people and burying them in a ritual circle around his own house for decades, literally living at the heart of his secret graveyard. The discovery was devastating. Ben had used his position, his access to files, and his knowledge of the patrol schedules to select his victims, dispose of them, and then quietly close the cases. His greatest defense was that he was the most trusted man in the forest. When the federal investigation finally hit, they found a hidden compartment in the supervisor's station attic, a macabre museum of his crimes. Wallets, driver's licenses, watches, wedding rings, trophies collected from every victim. The psychological toll of realizing I had spent 6 months eating dinner with a man surrounded by 20 corpses arranged in a perfect ritual ring was almost unbearable. Ben Hawkins was exposed, arrested, and charged with multiple counts of homicide. The relief, however, was tragically brief. While being transported to a maximum security facility, the transport van, driving through a remote, foggy stretch of highway, was involved in a freak accident. Ben Hawkins was found dead at the scene. I never believed it. No one did. The official report said the guard was distracted, the doors failed, and Ben took his chance, running into the traffic. But after the systemic protection of the I-80 ring and the cold calculation of the lonesome trail hunter, I knew what I knew. Ben Hawkins had somehow managed to escape, assisted perhaps by old friends, or simply using the confusion of the crash. He hadn't died. He had simply returned to the wild, a terrifying, veteran killer now unbound by bureaucracy. The reflective thought that consumed me was the final, devastating realization. I could never trust the surface peace of any wilderness again. The peace was the perfect camouflage for endless, systematic horror. Amy and I quit immediately. We sold everything, moving across the country to Phoenix, Arizona, where I took a job managing a mid-level corporate hotel, a place with fluorescent lighting, security cameras, and the reassuring banality of synthetic carpet. I had traded the beauty of nature for the safety of concrete and glass. But the forest wasn't done with me. The last story, the one that broke my sanity entirely, came to me third hand, a whispered warning that transcended mere human crime. I was 2 years into my life as a hotel manager, navigating the predictable horrors of continental breakfast and overflowing toilets, when the call came. It was from an old colleague, a former ranger named Vance who had worked the northern sector of the Obsidian Preserve before I arrived. He knew my history, knew why I had fled, and he called me, late one night, needing to confess something before it consumed him. Vance had taken a job at a place called Ridgeline State Park, famous for its picturesque, but strangely notorious, Moss Creek Path. Vance, like me, had found himself drawn to the official data, the grounding fact that over the last 50 years, dozens of people had gone missing along this specific 3-mile stretch of trail. Not just isolated incidents, but persistent, scheduled disappearances. The reports all contained the same impossible detail: footprints that suddenly and definitively stopped in the middle of the worn dirt path, as if the person had simply ceased to exist mid-stride. Moss Creek Path was where people didn't just get lost, they evaporated. Vance was new, but he had access to the archived files. He discovered that the park management, years ago, had classified the Moss Creek Path as a high-risk area, yet they had never closed it. They even maintained it meticulously, keeping the trail markers fresh, the parking lot clear, and the access gate invitingly open. Why maintain a magnet for tragedy? He started conducting clandestine surveillance, setting up motion-activated cameras off the official path, deep in the surrounding wetlands. The images he started retrieving didn't make sense. His cameras began to capture figures moving silently through the woods, not hikers, not animals, but entities wearing faded, archaic ranger uniforms, the heavy wool, wide-brimmed hats, and canvas leggings of the 1950s. They were impossibly thin, almost skeletal, and moved with a jerky, unnatural agility. They were always carrying something, not tools, but bundles of thick, dry reeds. Vance found the criteria in the oldest, handwritten park logs, filed under Phenomenon Protocol. The missing people weren't random. They were being collected according to strange, specific criteria. Individuals walking alone, wearing certain colors, usually bright reds or blues, carrying high-end metal equipment, GPS, expensive cameras, or, most chillingly, those who had recently expressed extreme emotional distress, like having recently suffered a deep personal loss. The speculative concept that Vance pieced together, and the one that finally destroyed my lingering sanity, was the collector entities. The lost people hadn't died. They had been absorbed into an adjacent reality coexisting with the preserve, becoming something else, something that wore the ghost of authority. They were previous victims, now transformed, living in another space, using the Moss Creek Path as a controlled funnel to collect new recruits based on their mysterious, specific rules. Vance had witnessed one of the disappearances through his hidden lens, a lone woman, hiking quickly, wearing a blue jacket. One of the skeletal rangers emerged silently from the reeds, simply reached out a long, pale hand, and touched her shoulder. The image flickered violently, and where the woman had stood, there was only the tall, rippling grass. The true horror, the one that makes your breath catch and your blood turn to ice, was the final revelation Vance made. He confronted the Ridgeline Park superintendent, demanding answers. The superintendent, a weary, defeated woman, finally broke the silence. The Moss Creek Path was not a mistake. It was a deal. The park management had known about the collector entities for decades. They knew the disappearances would happen, and they knew the entities needed a specific, regular tribute. If the path remained open, if the park continued to offer a steady, predictable supply of the lonely and the distressed, the collectors would stay contained to that 3-mile stretch. The alternative? If the supply stopped, if the path closed, the entities would feel the need to expand their hunting ground. They would come out of the woods, into the nearby town, to collect according to their criteria among the general population. The park staff were not guardians of nature. They were sacrificial shepherds. They intentionally left the Moss Creek path open as a sacrificial offering to prevent a supernatural plague from spilling into civilization. My reflective thought, the one that still keeps me staring at the popcorn ceiling of my Phoenix hotel room, is this: the woods don't hold secrets to protect themselves. They hold secrets to protect us from what they contain. Vance quit his job that same week, never even packing his belongings. He simply drove away from Ridgeline and never looked back, choosing the paranoia of the open road over the institutional horror of complicity. He called me from a rest stop somewhere in Nevada, whispering the final, devastating sentence of the entire saga. They need victims, and the uniform gives them access. I understood then that my entire career, from the organized crime of Obsidian, through the solitary hunters of Greenbelt, to the ritual killers of Whispering Pines, had been a slow, agonizing preparation for this supernatural truth. The greatest, most ancient dangers in the forest were the face of the service. The deep forest isn't a natural place anymore. It's a vast, dark cathedral built of isolation, where human law dissolves, and something ancient and hungry demands tribute. And I, Unit 14, Unit 22's helper, the man who found the body circle, had become one of the few who knows the real map. The map that shows where the living stop and the shadows begin. I am haunted not by guilt, but by knowledge. The morning light, thin and hesitant, is starting to bleed through the edge of the curtains, pulling the darkness away from the corners of the room. The oppressive weight of the night is lifting, but it leaves behind a chilling clarity, like dust settling on a perfect crime scene. You can exhale now. The voices recede as the city begins its gentle, predictable drone. But try to hold on to the understanding that the wilderness isn't just outside your door. It's an emotional condition, a place where the rules of civilization are willingly suspended by those who seek the deepest anonymity. Whether they are trafficking